Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about errors in Python. And we're going to talk about quite a few of them. I just want to tell you something about these built-in errors, the errors that come with Python, so that when they appear in your programs, you'll know exactly what they mean, and you don't have to, waste time trying to find out what they are and how they happened. So we're going to talk about a few errors. We're going to talk about the index error and what it means, a key error, and name error. These types of error happened when you accessed something that didn't exist or in the wrong way. We're going to look at attribute error, which is fairly related. And then we'll look at not implemented error. This is an error that you can use. That can be really handy. We're going to look at runtime error, quite a generic error. Then we're going to look at also syntax error. This happens when you mess up writing Python code. You don't write proper Python. We're going to look at indentation error and tab error. And these happen when you mess up with the spaces or tabs or when you mix them together. We're going to look at type error and value error. And these happen when you give the wrong values or values of the wrong type to some built-in functions. Then we're going to look at import error and when that happens. And we're also going to briefly talk about deprecation warning and how you can use that. So the index error. The index error happens when you do something like this. The first 3 lines, by the way, are just the Python introduction type thing when you run Python on your console. I'll teach you how to do that in a couple of sections' time. Basically, we've defined friends as Rolf and Anne, and then we've accessed friends2. But of course, friends2 doesn't exist because friends only has 2 things, 0 and 1. When you access friends2, that's an index error, because you accessed an index that didn't exist. In this case, it tells you that the list index was out of range. You're trying to access 2, but you only go up to 1. And this is a type of index error. Notice how the traceback tells you where the file, the line, and the module or function that you ran it in. And in this case, because I'm running Python in interpreter mode, that means you're just running Python interactively. It executes as soon as you type. So the file is just the thing I'm typing. That's what this file is called. And line is number 1 because, again, every line is number 1 in interpreter mode. And the module is just the module I'm running with. And that just means, when it says in module, that just means you are running the line directly. You're not going through any functions. So this is an index error. It happens when you access an index that didn't exist or an index that is otherwise incorrect. Then we've got key error, and this is fairly similar to the one we saw earlier. But now we have the proper code, movie name, movie director, and movie release. However, it should be year. And remember, in our milestone 1, we used the year key, and let's assume that we've used the year key for this bit of code as well. What we'll get then is this nice traceback. Again, what we've got now is a key error, and the description of this key error is pretty terrible. I don't like this description because it just says the key that you misused. So it says key error, release. Not terribly helpful, but now you know that you've used the release key at some point where you shouldn't have. And then, if the traceback is good, it'll give you which line that error happened. You've used it here in movie release. And then again it says, and this line was inside show movie details. Show movie details was executed as show movie details with movie inside it, and that happened inside show movies. That was executed inside the menu, and the menu was executed inside the module, or the file that you executed. Notice how all of these things are inside a file called app.py, because that's what our file was called in milestone 1. So the key error happens when you use a key incorrectly, or otherwise the key doesn't exist, but movie is a dictionary. Okay, so we've got movie being a dictionary, and then we accessed the incorrect key. If movie was a list, remember from the last video, we would get a different type of error. We also have name error. And the name error happens, as we saw earlier in the last video, when the variable is not defined. So here I've just launched Python and I said print hello, the variable hello, but of course hello is not defined, so I get a name error that says name hello is not defined. Of course, Print of the string hello would still work, because the string hello is just a set of characters and numbers, or symbols, and Python doesn't evaluate it to a variable at all. So that would work, but printing the variable hello doesn't work. This is actually a really common error for my students, where they forget to, or you guys forget to, put the quotation marks around the string. Happens to everybody, and just remember, if you get a name error for something that it's in a print, just check whether it needs quotation marks around it. That's a fairly popular thing, so just keep your eyes out. Let's also look at attribute error. Attribute error is pretty popular when you're starting to deal with objects. In this code here, we've got my friends list, which has 3 strings, Rolf, Jose, and Charlie. And then we've got some friends that are nearby, Rolf and Anna. And notice these 2 are lists, and then I'm doing friends.intersection of friends nearby. Intersection is something we can do with sets. If you recall, we looked at this earlier on in the course. It is not something you can do with lists. So then you get an attribute error. The list object has no attribute intersection. You can't do intersection because a list doesn't know what it is. So this is a nicer error message. It tells you what object you try to use, in this case a list object, and it tells you what you try to do that you cannot do, in this case use the intersection attribute. Okay. This is a pretty nice error. When you get it, you see, okay, I messed up, I used the wrong thing there. We've got not implemented error, and this is an error that you won't be seeing very often, but it's an error you can actually use. And here's how you can use it. We've got a class that has an init method, a constructor, and it takes in a username and a password, and then it sets them, and then it's got a login method. But we've not worked on the login method yet, so it doesn't work yet. Instead of returning none or doing nothing, we can instead raise a not implemented error. And this is the syntax for raising an error. We're going to look at this in more detail in the next couple of videos. And then inside the brackets, you can put a small description saying something like, this feature has not been implemented yet. What's going to happen is when somebody calls this method, they're going to get an error. And it's going to say, not implemented error, this feature has not been implemented yet. And then it's going to say, when you called user.login. So it's a pretty nice error to raise when you've not yet gotten round to implement something. A runtime error. Runtime error is a pretty generic error, and it's not terribly clear when it happens. I've seen it a couple of times, but it's not an error you'll be seeing very often at all. This is essentially a base error, a base class, and other errors inherit from this one. Other errors extend this one to be runtime errors. A runtime error is just an error that happens when you're running your program, so that's basically anything. We've got syntax error. Syntax error is when we mess up on Python. So here we've got somebody messing up in defining their class user. Can you spot the missing thing? For me, this is like a big blank where something should be. But of course, for you, it may not be so obvious for now. And as you get more familiar with Python, as you program more and you encounter more of these errors, this is going to start becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger missing thing, which is the colon. The colon is missing at the end of the class. This is illegal syntax because you've got class user and then it expects a colon afterwards, so you'll get a syntax error, the saying illegal syntax. Then we've got indentation error, fairly related, also a problem with syntax in Python, and the error could arise from something like this. You define the function @2, x and y, you put a colon after, and remember, the block of the function has to be indented. It has to have at least 2 spaces in front, preferably 4 spaces, but this return x plus y doesn't have any spaces in front. So you'd get an indentation error, and it would say something like indentation block expected after function definition or something like that. So basically, you can do this if you want. You can indent and put pass, and that just means this function does nothing. And then you can put the return x plus y at the bottom. But of course, this would also be an error. Do you know which error it would be? I hope you got that. It would be a name error, because of course x and y would not be defined. They are only defined within the function. Remember the concept of scope. They do not live outside the function. So as soon as the function ends, x and y no longer exist. You're using them here outside the function, because the function body is only the indented block. So this will give you a name error. You're trying to use x and y, two things that are not defined. Then we've got a tab error. A tab error is a pretty frequent error when you switch between editors. So just be careful when you're switching between editors that this doesn't happen. Here we've got add to function, and then the indented body has been indented with 4 spaces. That's what that little square bracket means, and that square bracket on the bottom of the line. Space, 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 return x plus y. So there's 4 spaces there, totally legitimate Python syntax there. You can indent using 4 spaces, but then notice how the pow function has been defined using a tab character at the start instead of 4 spaces, and Python doesn't really like it when you mix and match indentation types. So I'm actually not sure if this would work, but certainly within a function, do not mix and match types. Try to not mix and match indentation types at all in any of your programs. Decide now whether you want to use tabs or spaces and stick to that, at least within a project. So again, these are spaces, these are tabs. Don't mix them. Oh, and by the way, let's go back to this, and I will quickly just mention the pow function, what it does, because I don't think we've encountered this syntax before. We've got 2 arguments, n and exp, and then it's returning n times exp. And times in Python just means to the power of. And so that's n raised to the exp. For example, 2 to the 3 is 8, and so forth. Pretty nifty syntax there in Python. I don't think we've encountered that. Just wanted to mention it. Let's go over to a type error. The type error is pretty common, and a type error can happen when you do something like this. In the first line, we're adding 5 plus 5, and that gives us 10, as we would expect. In the second line, we're adding hi plus ha, and it's giving us hi ha, as you would expect, because it's concatenating the strings together. And then we're doing something that you should not do, which is add a string and a number. And an integer. Do not do that, for that will be a type error. You've given the plus function, which is a function, 2 types that it does not support. So both of these things should be the same type, and you've given it an int and a string, and it says unsupported operand types. By the way, the plus symbol is actually a function. It's a dunder function like len. We will look into that later on, at how you can use it. But the int and the string objects have the plus dunder function defined, and it says that you cannot add them 2 together. So then you get a type error. Notice that you get the type error because somebody defined the int and str classes as raising this type error when you pass in different types. It doesn't just happen magically. Somebody has actually written the code to give you this error when you do this. So just remember, there's no magic here. It's all programming. Somebody has written the code that raises this error. Let's move on to value error. Value error is also very common. It happens when you give built-in functions a value of the correct type, a value of the correct type potentially, but incorrect value. So here's an example. We are turning into an int a string, which is normally a fine thing to do, but the string cannot contain decimal places. If it does, it says, hey, you should really convert this into a float, and that's what you should do. So here we're calling the int function with 20.5 as a string, and it says value error, invalid literal for int with base 10, 20.5. 20.5 is not something you can give the int function. Normally, only built-in functions will raise a value error. If you want to raise value errors, I recommend that you create your own errors, which we're going to look at later on in this section. Finally, we've got import error. An import error is also really popular and is a big pain in the ass. And here's when it happens. You've got an import blog inside app.py, and then you've got blog.py, say that from app imports menu. Let's imagine you want to run the menu inside blog, or maybe app has some sort of variable you want to import or something. So what's happening here is that app is importing blog is importing app, and what happens when you import? Well, you go over to the file you imported and you run through it quickly, define the functions, execute any imports and so forth, And once that's done, you go back to the original file and you continue from right after the import. So importing blog actually runs blog.py. What happens when you run blog.py? Well, it has to go over to app.py and run that. The first line there is import blog, so it has to go back to blog and import app, and then it goes back to blog, and then so forth. This is a big ass circle, and what happens is, circular imports. This is what they're called, importing one file which imports the same file. You'll get a circular import. And this doesn't necessarily have to happen from between two files. You can have file A that imports file B, that imports file C, that imports file A. So you can have a circular import with many files, and it can be a bit of a hassle. So just be careful with your imports. You'll get an import error, and it will say something around the lines of circular import here. So be careful. If you get an import error, ask a question in the course Q&A. We'll be very happy to help you out. Finally, let's look at deprecation warning. A deprecation warning is, as it says there, a warning, not an error. However, Python treats it the same way. So if you produce one, if you raise one, your program will still crash. But it's meant to mean, hey, something wrong happened here. This thing that you tried to do is deprecated. And what does deprecated mean? Deprecated means that it is no longer the best way of doing something. There is now a better way of doing whatever it is you're trying to do. Let's look at this example code. We've got a user class, and at the top we've got from database import database. The user class has a constructor, and then it has two methods. A register method, which is an instance method, that writes to the database the username and password of the user. Then it also raises a deprecation warning, and it says, user register still works, but is deprecated. Then we've got a class method that is called register user, and that takes in a username and password, and writes to the database the username and password, and returns an object of type user. I like this second one better, that's why it's in this example. But nonetheless, it was just to show you that you can raise a deprecation warning in any of your methods to tell whomever uses it that, hey, this is no longer the accepted way of doing things. But, there is a but. Often you won't be raising any of these exceptions except possibly the deprecation warning, probably not even that one. You'll normally be raising not implemented error if you are sort of working on something. But you won't be raising many of these. You should create your own exceptions with even better names. And we will look at exactly what that means and what a better name is and how you can create your own exceptions. So let's look at that right now in the very next video. I'll see you there.